panel this afternoon, everyone. My presentation, Can the Subaltern Write, is a really provocative title that doesn't really represent what I'm talking about today, because I wrote that months ago, but it's tangentially related. Because what I'm talking about today is a research project I started years ago when I started to study the letters written by Black South African political leaders to this London-based Aborigines Protection Society in the 19th century. And I wanted to look at these letters as manifestations of Black political agency within imperial humanitarian networks. It was a type of agency that really hadn't been acknowledged by previous generations of historians. And what I found from that research was that, yeah, writing to the Aborigines Protection Society was a pretty common tactic for Black political leaders to try and lobby the British Parliament, but also raise awareness in the British public of their resistance efforts against settler encroachment. And I'm not talking about those letters today. If you want to learn more about those, my findings are coming out in the Journal of Colonialism later this month sometime. But what I'm talking about today is an uneasiness I started to develop about the form of agency that's manifest in the act of writing a letter. Because you can write a letter, but if it's not delivered to the right person, if it isn't opened in time, if it isn't interpreted in the right way, if it isn't acted upon, then the potential agency within the act of writing the letter is only partially realized, if realized at all. So I started to look at letters as acts of mediated agency, as agency that requires participation from multiple parties. And so when I started to look at letters that way, I began looking away from the act of writing to the act of reading, to look at how did the Aborigines Protection Society read these letters? Did it care that these political leaders were sending their petitions to them? Did it even believe their letters when it received them? And my overall argument today is that even though both white and Black South Africans wrote letters to the Aborigines Protection Society, Black writers had a much harder time having their letters taken seriously because they had a harder time establishing their credibility according to British standards of who's a credible source and who's not. And so my presentation today is first going to establish some of the context of why credibility was so important in late 19th century imperial communications. And then I'm just going to give 3 case studies of Black writers and the challenges they faced in trying to assert their credibility and trying to be listened to by metropolitan humanitarians. So the basic context, by the late 19th century, Britain had devolved most of its administrative control over the settler colonies to the settler governments. But even so, the British government still maintained a very strong symbolic power, but also some supervisory power over the settler colonies. It could veto acts of legislation if it chose to. And because of that, well into the 20th century, people from the colonies continued petitioning the British government, the Queen, and also third-party groups like the Aborigines Protection Society to try and bring their local politics to the imperial field. And some of these petitions took place in person. If you were lucky, if you had a lot of money, you could come and try to meet the Queen in person. But most of these petitions took form of a letter. And there was tons of letters. This little map is just something from the year 1884 in South Africa, this 1 year of petitions sent to the British government about this one thing. It was the annexation of what's today Botswana, that was called Bechuanaland. And like the British government, but also the Aborigines Protection Society was swarmed with petitions from all sorts of people, from colonial officials, from missionaries, from settlers, from indigenous peoples, all trying to convince them that their grievance was true. And so the society, as well as the government, had the difficult task of sorting out which grievance was true and which was not. And historians who look at Victorian notions of credibility have identified some heuristic biases that people leaned upon. Like gender was a big one. Myths of women as liars made women's testimony not as credible as men's testimony, especially in courts of law. And there were also various racialized stereotypes of people from India was a big one, of being effeminate, and because of that effeminacy, they were less trustworthy. All sorts of racialized stereotypes. But the APS, the society, was founded specifically to recognize the equality of races, as well as to give voice to Indigenous peoples around the empire. So I think it's really interesting to look at how they responded to Indigenous testimony. And the first case study I want to look at of how that worked was a man named Samuel Moroka. So Samuel Moroka was the son of a chief of a place called Taba Inchu, which is in the Orange Free State. It was an Afrikaner republic in central South Africa. And in 1880, Samuel's father died, and Samuel was about to become chief of Taba Inchu. But his half-brother, who had no claim to be chief, bribed the Orange Free State government to depose Samuel and banish him from the territory. And so Samuel's half-brother became chief, and Samuel was kicked out. And so Samuel wrote to the government, the British government, as well as the Aborigines Protection Society, lobbying them to try to get the Orange Free State to give him his land back and his territory back. And Samuel he had all the characteristics that Victorian humanitarians wanted in Indigenous peoples. He was Christian and he was educated. He was actually educated at St. Augustine's College in Canterbury, which was the Church of England's missionary college. And he leaned upon those characteristics to assert his credibility to the society. I'm not going to read this quote, but essentially he was just asserting to them that I am Christian, my father was Christian, we have had missionaries on our land for decades, and I've even been to England and I'm educated, so I am a trustworthy person. And the Aborigines Protection Society read this, and they launched this extensive investigation into his history to see if he really was educated and trustworthy as he said he was. So this investigation included writing letters to colonists that might know something about Samuel. Brian Knights was a lawyer in the Cape Colony, and Andrew Anderson was a surveyor in Orange Free State. For some reason, these settlers were taken as authorities on Samuel's credibility, but also writing to Samuel's old teachers in Canterbury. And all of these people, most of them, confirmed that yes, Samuel has been deposed by the Orange Free State, he's educated, he's Christian, you can listen to him. And so the society sort of did. It tried to censor some of his language. It didn't want to criticize the Orange Free State because they were an ally, they were neutral in South Africa, so it wouldn't criticize the Orange Free State, but it did support his efforts. But the point is not that the society investigated sources, it's that it only investigated Black sources. No similar investigation was ever conducted about the society's white colonists' correspondence. Like these two colonists, Brian Knights and Andrew Anderson, at the time, they were strangers to the Aborigines Protection Society, and they had no reason to be trusted over Samuel. But there was something about their whiteness, and they weren't more educated than him. It was just that they were whiter than he was. And so they became an authority of Moroka's credibility. And that sort of pattern was repeated over and over again. The second case study is sort of an expansion on that same pattern. That was John Tango Jabavu. Well, John Tango Jabavu, very similar to Moroka in some ways. He was from the Cape Colony. He was one of the more famous Black Africans of the time and in modern history. He became the first Black person to graduate from the University of Cape Town. He founded the first Black-owned and operated newspaper in the Cape Colony. It was called Imvu Zabasundu in 1884. He was a very prominent political activist and political leader. And in 1887, he began petitioning the Aborigines Protection Society about a law that was coming through the Cape Colony. It was called the Parliamentary Registration Act. It was designed to disenfranchise Black people by not allowing communal land to give them the vote. So it was this big issue that Jabavu was a leader in resisting. And when he wrote to the society, he leaned upon the same credentials that Moroka did. He was telling them, like, I have been graduated from University of Cape Town. I am a Christian. I am an editor of a paper. I am a credible person. And the society responded to him, asking for authentic information to prove his case that he was being disenfranchised. And that drove Jabavu crazy. And this is this quote. He said, "You asked me to send you authentic information as to the practical working of the measure in disenfranchising the natives. In this, I think I've anticipated your request in a former letter." Because he had sent them all of the laws that he said were unconstitutional. He sent them all the legal arguments because he knew this stuff. But the society said, give us proof. And Jabavu recognized that what they wanted was white proof, because he sent them in this letter, he sent them a report from a white lawyer confirming everything he'd already said. And so it's really fascinating that although John Jabavu and Samuel Moroka did they fit the mold of what the society's racialized ideas of civilization were, these Western ideas of education and Christian. They were it, but they still weren't credible enough to be trusted without white confirmation. And the situation was even worse for people who didn't have education and who weren't Christian, which is going to be my next case study. Although I also want to throw in that Jabavu, we can actually compare Jabavu's case with other white newspaper editors. Like there's this one editor named John Sanderson, who was editor of the Natal Colonist, which was another South African paper. And he wrote letters to the Aborigines Protection Society, and his letters were published verbatim. And there's no investigation into his credibility, but there was for Jabavu, even though they're exactly the same person, except one was white, one was black. So it's just really interesting to see how London humanitarians were treating the people they were supposed to be advocating for. But the situation was worse if you were not educated and not Christian, which was the case of Mankurwane, who Mankurwane was a chief of the Swana people in modern-day Botswana, and his territory was outside the border of the South African Republic, or the Transvaal, which was an Afrikaner republic. And in 1885, Britain declared a protectorate over his territory. And one of the rules of the Britain's protectorate was that Black people could not be represented by lawyers in court. Mankurwane's legal advisor was forbidden from practicing law, and Mankurwane's private secretary was banished from the territory. Britain just didn't want him having any legal representation or any help at all. And Mankurwane petitioned the Cape government, the British government, the Aborigines Protection Society, trying to get legal representation reinstated. But the problem was that he couldn't write. He had to use his legal advisors, which were the same people that he was trying to get reinstated. And that it was a blurry line of who was benefiting from these letters. Was Mankurwane benefiting from them by having legal representation? Or were his advisors being benefited because they would be allowed to practice law again? And so his use of them as translators and interpreters rendered his letters completely uncredible to anyone in London. So we have this one letter, for example. This letter is just a small snapshot of a longer petition asking for his legal advisor, John Donovan, to be allowed to practice law. And there's no credit for who translated this, but there's some witnesses at the bottom. One says A.W. Graff, and one says E.K. Khan. And you can sort of compare the handwriting, and you can kind of see that Ezekias Khan was the private secretary. He wrote this for him. He was the translator. And the society, Aborigines Protection Society, when it received this letter, responded that because it was bearing a strong probability of having been written at Donovan's suggestion and in his interest, they just dismissed it entirely. They didn't respond. They just threw it in the garbage, essentially. And it's the sort of catch-22 that if you're educated and Christian, then you could have a chance to prove that you're credible. But if you relied on other people, then you weren't credible at all. So it's a very difficult situation for Black South Africans writing to Britain authorities to be taken seriously. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to sort of conclude with the greater context of the British Empire is that like propaganda and fear of fraudulent letters was rampant. Like in the situation where everyone's writing to the imperial government, trying to convince them of their information. It's what Christopher Bailey calls imperial propaganda, and that settler groups, mission societies, colonial governments, indigenous peoples, they all wanted to influence the representation of the colonies in Britain. And they relied upon technologies of letter writing, but also infrastructure of the imperial postal system to do that. But as these sort of case studies demonstrate, that the technology of letter writing and the infrastructure of the postal system were not a level playing field. Some people were had a much harder time utilizing those technologies because of this social concept of credibility. And so I kind of like to reflect, if you will, on why that's important for both people studying the past, but also people concerned with misinformation today. It's a huge topic today about, especially with the whole COVID information pandemic, everyone's concerned about misinformation, and everyone's telling people to learn about identifying credible sources and not credible sources. But if we look at the historical nature of credibility, we can see that not only is it culturally relevant, but it can also be used against people to silence or to marginalize people if they don't fit one group's definition of credibility. So it's always important to historicize these concepts we use in everyday life. And to finally wrap up, if you want to look at these letters, I have a digitized archive on my own website, link on the screen, that you can look at if you wish to. Thank you very much.